Ypres is a city of memorials. Everywhere there are reminders of the young men who were slaughtered in the battles of the First Global War.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
While the soldiers who gave their lives are remembered, a chapter of this story has been forgotten for decades. The role of 140,000 workers recruited by the British and French in China in order to free up more European men for the battlefront. It was here in the mud and carnage of Flanders that most of the Chinese labourers came to work behind the front lines, digging trenches and toiling in the docks and arms factories for the Allies. But they were also digging the foundations for the 21st century's rising superpower. It was a gamble by the Chinese government to send thousands of its citizens to Europe, but they hoped it would win them more status in the West and the rights to Germany's colonial possessions in China. The main motivation for the workers was money.
My father, like most Chinese, wanted to leave China in order to have a better life, because in China at that time, poverty was everywhere. Most of the Chinese who came were illiterate, so if they could not sign the work contract, they used a thumbprint instead.
Now all of a sudden you have tens of thousands of Chinese really coming to the heart of whiteness, as to paraphrase Joseph Conrad. And by consequence, it also brought a major culture shock to both parties.
The 100,000 Chinese working for the British Army were confined in camps under armed guard behind the front line. Although they were out of range of enemy fire, death found them anyway. This is the site of the old Chinese camp at Popperinghe. German airplanes are flying low overhead, and one of the Chinese workers came out of the hut to take a look at them and lit a cigarette in the blackout. The ensuing bomb killed at least 10 men and wounded 30. The remaining Chinese fled in panic, and some of them didn't stop running for at least 2 hours.
They had no idea about the war or the situation in France and Europe. It had a great impact on them. They were completely traumatized by the war and its violence.
And they had more than the enemy to worry about. The workers had unknowingly committed themselves to 3 years military discipline under their British officers. Punishments included being tied to a post or barbed wire, fines for insubordination, and prison sentences for strikers.
They would be described as children who need a good flogging in order to do their proper work. The British having that empire, and the empire in fact being ruled by a very tiny group of Europeans, could only exist through the myth of white superiority. And so that white superiority, which also became very embedded in the British mind, was also shown towards the Chinese labourers.
We know the local people felt sympathetic towards the victims of harsh British treatment due to a Belgian priest who kept a diary throughout the war. Father Van Wellingen preached at this church here in Dikkebus. He relates how residents joined in the Chinese New Year celebrations in 1918, and shopkeepers learned a few words of Mandarin to welcome their new customers. In the diary, Father Wellingen records that far from being the docile slaves the Allies expected, the workers became mutinous when disputes about their conditions of employment broke out.
At some of the camps, the Chinese are starting to get quite rebellious. Yesterday, they stabbed an English officer. Today, 30 of them at Busseboom refused to work. They just lay on the ground, waiting to be hit.
Along with the illiterate labourers came a few hundred Chinese students to act as interpreters. The two classes would never normally meet, but were thrown together by the war. Working side by side in the factories of France sowed the seeds of a social conscience in China's elite, with lasting consequences.
France acted as a bridge between the Chinese intellectuals and the Chinese workers. The Chinese workers became more politically aware, and the Chinese intellectuals finally understood the misery and poverty of their people.
One of the translators, Gu Xinqin, wrote his memoirs in 1937. His book describes how the intellectuals came to understand the importance of the labourer's contribution. For many, it was a kind of political awakening.
You can't win a war without relying on the workers. It is important to make it clear what we should call working soldiers are the main artery of the army.
They may have ended up on the winning side, but in the lawless times after the armistice, conditions were even tougher for the Chinese. Many were killed by unexploded shells when collecting bodies from no man's land, or died in the Spanish flu epidemic that engulfed Europe, and the locals turned against them.
The Chinese became scapegoats for everything that went wrong.
And further betrayal awaited them in Paris. Expectations were running high as the Chinese had won their place at the peace conference, but they came away with nothing. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles handed over Germany's colonial possessions in China to Japan. The Chinese diplomats were staying at the Lutetia Hotel. When the news broke, Chinese students in Paris surrounded the building to prevent them from leaving. It's hard to know how many workers took part in the protests, but in Gu's memoirs, he writes that one of the labourers sent a pistol to the head of the Chinese delegation with the message that he should use it on himself if he dared to sign the treaty, or he would come and kill him. China's humiliation at Versailles triggered student protests back in Beijing, which became known as the May 4th movement. Feeling betrayed by the West, the protesters looked for new sources of inspiration. In time, this led to the triumph of the Communist Party.
The Chinese workers' participation steered China towards a sort of revolution, a revolution for the people.
By 1920, the British had sent home all of their workers, but the French allowed 3,000 to stay on after the war. Unlike the British, the French had allowed the Chinese to mix with the local population, and in some cases, romance blossomed. Gérard's father was determined to stay.
I don't know. I think it was love.
Gérard's parents went on to have 13 children.
These are my memories. They're all I have left. They're part of me. If Colonel Troop-Thiel hadn't gone to recruit the Chinese in 1917, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today.
There are 10 military cemeteries in France and Flanders where Chinese labourers are buried. Visitors are often surprised to see Chinese characters on the gravestones. But as the centenary of the First World War approaches, their role in the making of modern China is finally being recognised and reassessed.
The official communist view of the Communist Party has always been that the First World War was an imperialist war and that China had nothing to do with it. On the other hand, more and more there is this view of, well, we are an emerging world power, so let's see how China behaved on the world stage in the past.
There have been a lot of memorials to the soldiers who died, but it's also worth remembering the contribution of a small group of men who travelled halfway across the world and began something whose significance is only just becoming clear 100 years later.